Good evening. I'm Paul Prebenow, the president here at Augsburg University. It's my great privilege to welcome you to the spring semester 2018 Sabo Symposium. Every semester we do these gatherings on various important social issues and things that are important to us as a community, both here at Augsburg and the wider community. I want to say a special word of welcome to Silvia Sabo, who's right there in the middle. Just this recognition of how Silvia and Martin, so many. It's his birthday today. Oh, for heaven's sakes. Well, we remember that. 80 years old. I remember that. I remember when we celebrated. Yes, wonderful. Well, very meaningful to know that in this way we have the opportunity and the privilege to continue Martin's remarkable legacy. In our Lutheran Christian tradition, founded by a university professor, what he taught us to ask about pretty much anything in the world is a simple question: what does this mean? What does this mean? And it strikes me that at the core of our conversation tonight is, in fact, that question: what does this mean as we look at changing demographics and profiles and dynamics in our society, and think especially about these kind of core commitments that we have to faith in whatever form it takes, faith as understood in a variety of ways, but also to the ways that we are called to be citizens in the world. And I think tonight's theme and various ways that we'll address that with a keynote speaker as well as with panels that will allow us to engage in conversation, we have a chance to ask, what does this mean for our life in the 21st century? And certainly for those of us here at Augsburg, this is a particularly pressing issue because at our heart, we have a deep commitment to the role that faith plays in whatever form it takes to the connection to learning and then to service and engagement with the world. And at the same time, we have a deep commitment to civic engagement, to community engagement, to the ways that we serve our neighbors. And so we know that these two pieces come together, and it's quite, I think, meaningful tonight also that this young man that I'm about to introduce actually represents that in many ways in his own life and work. So Chris Stedman is a 2008 graduate of Augsburg, a religion major while he was here. Went on to do a master's degree at the Meadville Theological Seminary in Chicago. While there, worked at the Interfaith Youth Corps, which is this fascinating organization run by a man named Ibu Patel that actually is engaging university campuses and thinking about interfaith work of a variety of ways. Chris then went on to be the humanist chaplain at both Harvard and at Yale universities. And about a year ago, made the decision to come back home to the Twin Cities, where he's involved in a variety of projects in the community, which you'll hear more about, but in particular came back home to Augsburg, where he has two positions, actually. He is both a fellow in the Christensen Center for Vocation, which is the place where we, in fact, explore issues of faith and how they play themselves out in our students' lives, but he's also a fellow in the Sabo Center for Democracy and Citizenship. So I think it was particularly appropriate that he represents that intersection in his work, and it's my pleasure now to ask Chris to introduce our speaker and program. Chris?
Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you all so much for being here tonight. I'm really looking forward to this program. I think it's going to be a really fascinating conversation, and I hope you are as well. First, I want to thank Augsburg University and specifically the Sabo Center for Democracy and Citizenship for supporting this event. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the American Humanist Association Center for Education, First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, the Humanists of Minnesota, Minnesota Atheists, the Circle of Reason, St. Paul Interfaith Network, and Inner Belief Conversation Cafe. We are so grateful to have all of you involved in this program, and we encourage everyone in attendance tonight to check out the work of your organizations. Finally, I want to offer a special thank you to all of our speakers and our panelists, who you'll learn more about shortly, and to the organizing committee, Elaine, Jackie, Noah, and Evan. Thank you for all your work on making this event come together. The idea for this symposium first started coming together actually in December 2016, when Elaine and I began to collaborate on my fellowship for the Sabo Center for Democracy and Citizenship, which is focused on the non-religious and civic engagement. For the better part of a decade prior to returning to Augsburg here as a fellow, I worked at both Harvard and Yale as a humanist chaplain, where I helped to organize communities for non-religious students and members of the broader general public. I was one of only a handful of people in the United States hired by a university to provide specific support for non-religious people, and like my colleagues at other institutions, I often struggled with how to serve this population, given how much we're still learning about the diversity of this population's needs. Now that I'm back in Minnesota, working at the Sabo Center and with a number of humanist and secular organizations, And I'm doing that to explore what it would look like to open a center for humanist and non-religious life here in Minnesota. But before a center is possible, we need to better understand the non-religious. So I'm collaborating with researchers, some of whom you will hear from tonight, to build a comprehensive survey to study the beliefs, practices, and community affiliations of the religious nuns here in Minnesota. If you would like to get involved in that survey, if you'd like to learn more, there's a sign-up sheet on the table right outside there where you can find also information about the organizations that are supporting this event. And we encourage you to leave your email address if you are, in fact, interested in learning more. The nuns, and I should clarify that's N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, or those who do not claim a religious affiliation, are both the fastest growing segment of the religious landscape here in the US, and also significantly misunderstood. Even those of us who have worked with them for years don't understand them as well as we should, as well as we would like to. Their needs, their beliefs, and how they plug into their broader communities. Some researchers, like Robert Putnam at Harvard, have suggested that the non-religious are less civically engaged than their religious peers, meaning they vote less, volunteer less, give less money to charity. But is this really true? And in a time of political polarization, as many are seeking to increase political and civic participation, it feels really critical to understand the nuns better, to understand how they engage with their broader communities. Whether you're religious or not, I think we can all agree that our shared life depends on people from all across the religious spectrum getting involved in our broader communities, including, and perhaps especially, those who do not identify as religious. Fortunately, we've got an amazing lineup of scholars, activists, and elected officials tonight who will hopefully help us begin to better understand this diverse and growing segment of the population. From tonight's keynote speaker and respondents who study the nuns, to our panel of elected officials and community organizers who work with them, we will hear many different perspectives tonight. Okay, I better stop talking and get out of the way so that we can actually get to hearing from those folks. So I have the privilege of introducing tonight's keynote speaker. After he speaks, he will be joined by the thoughtful and wonderful Jackie Frost and Evan Stewart for a discussion, and you can find their bios in the program. So Phil Zuckerman is the author of several books, including The Non-Religious, Living the Secular Life, Faith No More, and Society Without God, and the editor of several volumes, including the Oxford Handbook of Secularism. He is a professor of sociology at Pitzer College and the founding chair of the nation's first secular studies program. He blogs for Psychology Today and the Huffington Post, and he lives in Claremont, California with his wife and 3 children. Please join me in offering a warm and enthusiastic welcome to Phil Zuckerman.
Thank you. Just and somebody's going to tell me when my time is up, right? You're going to great. Thank you so much for having me. Takske he, if anybody speaks any Scandinavian here at Augsburg, I don't know. Okay, and thanks to Chris and Elaine for facilitating this and really communicating and everything. So, and thanks for the wonderful weather. Man, Minnesota in February is gorgeous. Love it. I have my dad has a friend, Victor, that he grew up with, and when I started studying secularism and atheism and humanism and whatnot, he started to tease me a little bit, and every time I see him at family gatherings, he kind of approaches me and says like, well, how's the atheism business? And for the last 10 years or so, I'm like, it's booming, Victor, it is booming. So I'm in, it's, and you see the way things change, and I'm going to present a lot of percentages and numbers, but it's hard to capture the change except in these little ways that always strike me. So I'll just give you one example from this like 2 weeks ago. I was approached by some publisher of high school textbooks, and they are producing a series of volumes for high school students on the different world religions. And they're going to be written by different people. And they asked me to be an outside expert to kind of review a volume on the non-religious that would be part of this series of books. And I said, sure. And so they sent me the PDF, and it was maybe, like a nice 35-page with graphs and pictures and little boxes, just kind of talking about what secularity is, what it means to be non-religious, some history. And I thought, wow, this really, to me, this was a symbol of the real change we're seeing here, that some academic publisher of a high school series thought to include the non-religious in this book on religion. That's really unprecedented, right? Things dramatically have changed. I hate to do this, but if you think about back in what happened to good old Abner Cleland in 1838 in Massachusetts, when he publicly spoke about free thought and voiced some secular ideals, he was imprisoned for 60 days. When in 1877, when L.J. Russell organized a meeting of free thinkers that gathered to hear some ideas, that night, this was in Texas, 5 or 6 men showed up at his house, took him outside and beat him senseless and said, you're never to have such a gathering again, right? And then we go up to 1887, Elmina Drake Slanker of Virginia. She was a leader of the free thought movement, also about open sex ed. She was sentenced to 6 months in a rat-infested prison for speaking publicly about her secularity, her skepticism, her free thought. And yet we fast forward to 2018, Augsburg University, an affiliate of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, openly having an event like this with speakers like me. To me, that's wonderful. And here we are now today with over 60 million Americans claiming to be non-religious. So I don't know if that's depressing to some of you or really exciting to some of you. I don't know if we have the secular side of the room and the religious. I don't know, but anyway. Can't really say, can I get an amen when you're talking about secularism? We need to come up with a new term. So I have, oh, there we go. So I have 3 tasks tonight. I was asked to present some data concerning, how many secular people there actually are in the United States. So what are we talking in terms of numbers? To talk about some key demographics in terms of race, gender, et cetera, and how that correlates with secularity in America. And talk a little bit about how this informs a lot of our political and social issues of the day. And I was told to do this in between 20 and 30 minutes. So here we go. I'll do my best to convey this information, and hopefully it'll help you get a sense of the landscape here. So as you know, the rise of the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S's, has been probably the main story for those looking at religiosity in America in the last decade or so. In fact, National Geographic ran a cover story about 2 years ago saying the new world religion, no religion. It's been on the cover. I remember Time magazine charted the 10 trends changing America, and the rise of the nuns was one of those 10 changes. And this is happening elsewhere in other countries around the world. We're seeing skyrocketing secularity from Scotland to Brazil, from Jamaica to Iraq, but I'm going to focus on the United States here. So when Americans were asked back in the 1950s and 60s, what is your religious affiliation or what is your religion? And they were presented with various options. Sometimes they were quite limited, 8, Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim. Sometimes there's 37 options. You can choose from this kind of Christian, this kind of Protestant, this kind of Catholic, so on and so forth. But in these, there's also been a kind of little box that says none of the above. None of these. And you have to think about the person that would tick that box, right? Because what that means is if you're going to check, if you see this list, right, and you check none, that means, in my opinion, you've really severed ties with a religious identity that's even beyond, you've cut a link to a certain heritage or tradition in your family. So, for example, if I'm presented with that question, what religion are you? If I see Jewish, it's hard for me not to tick Jewish. Like, I'm not a believer. I don't, I don't eat beef, but I would eat a cheeseburger if I did. And I mean, I'm not really involved, but it's part of my heritage and my culture. So to pick none of the above. And so if you think about people who are raised Catholic, people who are raised Lutheran, even if they're non-practicing, even if they're non-believing, if you see that on a survey, it's hard not to tick that, right? So someone who's going to tick none of the above really has come to a place where they're not identifying with a religious tradition. So back in the 1950s and 60s, fewer than 5% of Americans would tick that no religion or none of the above, right? In the 1970s and 80s, less than 10%. In 2014, headline news, it was 2001 that 14% said none of the above, and that was headline news. Pew survey has now got it at 23% of Americans ticking none, no religion. And in 2018, it seems to be much higher. So the latest I was able to see was the American Family Survey, which found that 34% of Americans say they were, quote, atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. So that survey actually gave those terms, atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. And just so you know, the American Family Survey is not a think tank run by Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Ayaan Hirsi Ali. It's run out of Brigham Young University. So this is not something they are wanting to find necessarily. Or I don't know, maybe it would help with fundraising. I don't know. But anyway, the point is this is not, if they're ideologically motivated, they're not coming from a secular position. So that's about 34% of Americans, if this is correct. Now, just to give you a sense, that actually places the non-religious as the largest single religious, for lack of a better word, we got to figure out our vocabulary, group in America. So 34% of Americans saying they have no religion. Well, 33% identify as Protestant, 21% identify as Catholic, 2% as Muslim, 2% as Jewish, 1% Mormon, and the rest are lower than 1%. So that's pretty staggering. So either a low-end estimate of 23% from 2014 or a high end of 34% today, we can safely guesstimate that around a third of 28, 29, 30% of Americans now say they have no religion. Demographically, this is staggering, right? If you think, in my lifetime, I was born in 1969 when about fewer than 5% said they had no religion, to today, around 30% of Americans. And it's not only staggering, but it's unprecedented, right? I often present this data, and someone from the audience will say, well, these things are cyclical, right? Religion comes and goes. No, we've never seen this many people say they have no religion in the history of the United States and in other countries as well. We don't have that, there was that period in the 1780s when everybody opted out, so we don't know what's going to happen. It certainly could go like this, but we don't have the historical record of this. Now, among millennials, which I'm going to focus on a bit, I think that's a big factor here, it's even more interesting. A PRRI study from 2016 found that 39% of Americans in their 20s, 39% said they had no religion. Now, keep in mind, people in that age bracket often drop away from religion, right? That 18 to 25 is a sort of time when either you're going off to college or you're working in a new job, making money, you're somehow out from under perhaps the confines of your parents, and you're often, maybe you're not married, maybe you don't have kids, so religion suddenly tends to take a back seat. And we know that people in that age range, often when they do get married and have kids, return to the fold. Suddenly it's like, oh, wait a minute, we gotta baptize our kid, and we want our child to go to Sunday school or whatnot. So a certain percentage always do return, but it's a minority. And the fact is that chunk is getting larger and larger. And what do I mean by that? So back in 1986, I graduated from high school in 87. Anybody? Okay, yes, thank you. According to the CIRP freshman survey, which asks incoming freshmen all kinds of questions, back in the late 80s, 10% of incoming college first years said they had no religion. In 2016, 31% of incoming college freshmen said they had no religion. So even if 25% of these do eventually return to the fold when they get a little bit older and settle down, that still demographically, the numbers are larger in the secular side. Okay, so where are we at? Somewhere around 30% of Americans are affirmatively non-religious. But does that mean they are all atheists? Of course not. When you ask someone, what religion do you identify with here, and they tick none, that's all that is asking about is an affiliation, a sort of communal identity or a heritage. It's not asking them what they believe in terms of God or Jesus or Muhammad or miracles or any of that. And we have to be careful not to assume that the nones, N-O-N-E-S's, means atheist. It doesn't. Not at all. Many people who tick none of the above, they just may be unaffiliated, but they may have a deep spiritual life, a rich spiritual life. In fact, their spirituality may be such that they don't want to identify with their religion because they feel it doesn't capture their soul and their heart, right? Many believe in God, even though they don't affiliate, or a higher power. Many would define themselves, again, as spiritual but not religious. So it's hard to say. Now, on a side note, I am going to throw this one out, though. If a lot of people who say they're non-religious are actually believers, I wonder if you think people who do say they're religious are non-believers. And I wonder which one's bigger, How many husbands and wives are going to church because of their husband and wife and not because of the Lord, right? Amen to that. Like, happy family. I don't care. But we got to keep that in mind. Okay. So it is very hard to get an actual count if you really want to know about atheism, how many people are actually non-believers here. What are we talking? It's very difficult. Why? People don't like atheists. We're, at least in the United States, we are not a beloved. We're seen as unpatriotic. More than anything, we're seen as immoral. A lot of research on that. Will Gervais' work from University of Kentucky attests to that. So most people, atheist label is a stigma. We're considered, immoral, kind of mean and rude, strident, condescending. Whenever I assign these books by atheists, the students always say, "What jerks? They just think they're such know-it-alls and they look down on everybody else and blah blah blah." Okay, not everybody, but some. Okay, so what that means is people, when asked by a sociologist or a researcher, "Are you an atheist?" are reluctant to say yes. They don't want to be associated with this stigmatized identity. So, for example, back in 2007. Only 1.6 of American responders to this survey said they were an atheist. It ticked up in 2014 to 3.1%. I mean, that's no small potatoes. That's, the Jews are only around 2%, so that gives you a sense. Half of them are atheists. But anyway, and then I did find a Gallup poll from 2015 that said 11% of Americans did not believe in God. They didn't like the label atheist, but they admitted to whoever was asking that they didn't believe in God, and that's significant, right? If African Americans make up around 12 to 13% of the U.S., okay, 11% is a pretty hearty chunk. However, it's still nothing comparable to that 30%, right? 3%, 11%, it's way lower than that 30% of the non-religious. I mentioned Will Gervais earlier. He's a nice young man at University of Kentucky, and he, oh man, thank you, here we go. And so, okay, got 10 more minutes. Let me tell you what he did. He uses this great technique that social psychologists employ called the unmatched count technique. It's a way to get information about people if they don't want to admit to something. And so what he did was he gives a list of statements, 10 statements. I'm a vegetarian. I like modern art. I own a dog, and so on and so forth. And then he just says to people, how many of these statements are not true? 4, 2. So you don't know which statements. It just says, of these 10 are not true for you. So he did a national survey of that and got a certain number where a certain amount of people, the average was maybe 3. Then he had another sample asking the exact same questions, but added one more. I believe in God. So it was like, I'm a vegetarian. I like modern art. I own a microwave, I believe in God, and then said, how many of these are not true for you? And you don't have to pick which ones. The number jumped significantly, and the only change was that one item. So when you compare these two samples, you get a sense of, wait a minute, what's going on? So according to his calculations, 26% of Americans do not believe in God if asked in that way. As my time's running out, let's talk about some key demographics. Most important, race, right? The color line in America couldn't be a more significant fissure. So what do we find? In 2014, when Pew asked, of those who picked none, of those who said, I have no religion, 63% identified as white. 68%, and that's a slight over representation because 63% of Americans identify as white. 9% identified as black, the slight underrepresentation. 5% as Asian American, that's actually right on par. And 13% as Hispanic or Latino, slight underrepresentation. But among millennials, so that's nationally, among millennials who say they have no religion, check this out. 57% are white, that's an underrepresentation. 11% African American, that's almost on par. 8% Asian American, that's a slight overrepresentation. And 19% identify as Latino, that's an overrepresentation. So we're seeing some greater racial diversity among the millennial nuns than their older cohorts. And I've seen other studies that are showing some increase as well. For example, in the African American community, back in 2007, 12% of black Americans identified as having nothing in particular, no religion. But by 2014, that had grown to 18% of African Americans saying they have no religion. And among African American millennials, 29% saying they have no religion. Almost a third of African Americans in their 20s not identifying with a religion. Significant. Among Latinos, a 2017 study found that 20% of Latinos at large did not identify with a religion, but among millennials, 31% of Hispanics and Latinos not identifying with a religion. Among Asian Americans, 26%. In terms of men and women, of those who identify as having no religion, 57% male, 43% female. So there's a real gender imbalance there that is pretty consistent on many surveys and on many measures of religiosity. We can talk about why that might be.